So good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the empires of ancient Mesopotamia. And I know this is something I could teach an entire class on, and I know I say that all the time, but it really is something I have taught an entire class on. So this is something we have to kind of look at as a very pared down response, and we're going to look at four state level systems that span most of the history of ancient Mesopotamia. And I want to focus primarily today on what you read for the Parker article about ideas of how states maintain control and hegemony through symbols and iconography. So we're going to look at a couple of these societies and look at some very specific examples of iconography in each one that point to how elites are able to maintain power through ideas rather than through direct force, which is at the same time always applied as well. But remember, as we keep talking about, the state doesn't like to rely on direct force because that then leads to resentment and rejection of the state ideology. So you need to have some kind of cultural mechanism to be able to maintain that power. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I want to start with early dynastic Mesopotamia. This is the period right after the Uruk period that we left off talking about. So we see a lot of archaeological continuity throughout the southern Mesopotamian alluvium here in the early dynastic period. And this period is not really empires in the way that we would generally think of them until the very end under the consolidation of Lugal-Zaggisi. But what we see from most of the early dynastic period is that the southern Mesopotamian alluvium was divided into small city-states. And if you kind of think back to Greek history before the consolidation of the Grecian state in the Peloponnesian Wars, what we kind of see is that Athens and Sparta and all these states are battling with each other, either through trade or direct conflict, for kind of control. And that's kind of what we see here. So city-states like Uruk and Ur and Isin and Nippur and Kish are all existing in these areas controlling hinterlands around the cities. And what we see is a lot of conflict between these city-states. And this is tested archaeologically because we see large areas of the southern Mesopotamian alluvium that are actually abandoned. They're arable land that you could grow crops on, but because they fall in an area between, say, Uruk and Larsa here, there's a band that we call a buffer zone that nobody is living in, nobody's occupying. So these two city-states can have that space for battle because it's just too contentious to live there. So this conflict is oftentimes also depicted as a conflict between the gods. Each of these city-states, as we talked about last class, has its principal deity. So the excavations at Uruk focused on the areas that were represented in this early dynastic period as the temples of Nana and Inanna, the moon god and the goddess of love and war in the Sumerian pantheon. So what we can kind of see here is that each of these city-states has their own god. And the result of losing a conflict was oftentimes that the god's statue was taken down or removed to the victor city as a way of metaphorically claiming control over that city's god. And so we can kind of think about this as the gods themselves as controlling and housed inside a city, also engaged in a metaphorical or spiritual battle between each other for supremacy. So the god's house, as housed in the city, was reflective of the power of the god. So if your city won, your god was more powerful. So we can kind of see this in the early dynastic period is playing out throughout most of the Mesopotamian alluvium here, which each of these city-states battling for both spiritual supremacy in terms of the gods, but also an economic supremacy in controlling more and more population for extractive resources, as Scott talks about. So we generally divide the early dynastic period into three phases. There's a lot that we can kind of see going on here with the continuation from the Uruk state, but we can see further and further bureaucratic administration and development throughout each of these stages. So we see that transition in the use of writing. And starting in the early dynastic 3, we start to find that writing starts to expand outside of those direct bureaucratic administrative facilities and starts to record the deeds of kings, and priests are writing down religious beliefs. And this is the time period where we believe we see things like the Epic of Gilgamesh are finally being written down. One of the most important of these is the Sumerian Kings list, and this records the dynasties from each of these city-states that had ruled over Sumer since the beginning of time, going all the way back to the first city at Eridu. Now, we also see kings, or Lugals in the Sumerian, who are now starting to bureaucratically manage these city-states. It's no longer just the temple organization. The temples and the palaces have now kind of divided into separate institutions. And so the rulers of the kings are controlling those temple exercises, but they're not necessarily directly in charge of the temples any longer. The kingship position has consolidated. And rulers of these city-states, we can see, depending on who's in control of overarching systems, had kind of three designations. We have an N, or a lord, an NC, which we might think of like as a governor, and a Lugal, who's the king. Now, archaeologically, there's still a lot to be kind of understood. We don't know exactly how these definitions and names were applied to each other, but it appears to be some sort of hierarchy, with a Lugal, a king, overseeing several NCs or governors, and the NCs themselves then overseeing the lords within the city-state or villages. So we might think about this even within, say, the hierarchy of a city-state, the main city being headed by a king, the regional centers around it, the agricultural villages, each having an NC, and then those N's, lords, being the heads of local households, or something like that within the city-state or the village. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is believed to have been written this time, and it records the efforts of the king of Uruk, who we know was likely a historical character, although there's still some debate about it. Estimates suggest he was king sometime around 2900 BCE in the early Dynastic 1, and he's responsible for building the Wall of Uruk, which is built around the city around this time. The other thing that we see is that King Enme-Baragesi of Kish is listed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and archaeological excavations there at Nippur have confirmed this with two alabaster vases that have his name on it, where he is said to have built the first temple there. So we can kind of see this as being a reflection of those day-to-day interactions. And this reorganization of society can really be seen at the site of Kafaja. This site is occupied from the Uruk period on, and in the Uruk period occupation of the site, we see the Temple of Sin as the primary economic structure at the site, and Sin being the Mesopotamian god of the moon here. In this sense, in the early Dynastic 1, we have temples that lacked productive activities, but they were extracting resources from throughout the household. So each of these neighborhoods at Kafaja had their own temple complexes that would have been then overseen by the larger political institution. And in the early Dynastic 2, we see new temples taking over, but now the temple is no longer an extractive resource, it's a productive resource. And that's what you see here in the temple oval. You have the temple inside an interior wall, but between the outer wall of the temple and the inner wall, there's a house that was called House D. And this house contains a lot of productive activities for the production and processing of grain and pottery and metalworking. So what we can see is the temple is now, each of these neighborhood temples is now also a productive organization within the community. So we have this kind of extensive production of material wealth for the temple rather than extracting it from the local population. And by the early Dynastic 3, we can see the emergence of very clear temple neighborhoods. And each temple within the city is kind of vying for hegemony or control within the city hierarchy. So we can kind of think about this as isolated neighborhoods who are then vying for power and prestige from within the city itself. And then in the late early Dynastic period, the area around the temple oval is completely remodeled around a singular temple that appears to have maintained that control and has associated itself with the state.